This is Bart Peterson, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Greg Gilchrist, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Dan DeMarco, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network. In this episode, I visit with Shon Ramey. Shon is the General Counsel of Navex Global, and we visit about Navex Global's acquisition of Lockpath, a leading provider of integrated risk management solutions. Navex Global has announced their business purpose is to see customers' risk management and compliance programs mature and succeed, and with this acquisition, they hope to be able to move that desire forward. It's a very interesting podcast in terms of not only Navex Global and what they're trying, their business strategy, but also we take a deep dive into Shon Ramey's M&A protocol. And from a compliance perspective, I think you'll find it very interesting on how he thinks through the mergers and acquisitions process as General Counsel and also from the compliance perspective. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode. And today I have with me Shon Ramey. Shon is the General Counsel at Navex Global. And Navex Global recently announced an acquisition to acquire Lockpath. And so I asked Shon if he could come onto the podcast and talk a little bit about the acquisition, what it means for Navex Global, and where he may see things going forward. So, Shon, with that introduction, first of all, welcome and thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've watched and kind of followed you, and this is definitely a great honor to be on the program. So
I rarely have someone who practiced law in Houston with me on the program, not with me, but in the same town. So I really wanted to ask if you could talk about your professional background a little bit and how you got to Navex Global.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Very quickly, I had the privilege and pleasure of going to University of Virginia School of Law. I think that prepped me for my career. Started my career actually in Houston with one of the big four at the time. Moved around since. I have the unique distinction of being a partner and or a lawyer at the world's largest law firm twice, and they were different law firms. Had gone in-house a couple of times, and about 6 years ago, the opportunity came up to come back to the Pacific Northwest, which I call home, and actually wear a white hat and be in the ethics and compliance space. So it was a wonderful opportunity, and I've enjoyed it.
So, Shon, let's turn to the acquisition. At least the press release announcing it was dated August 6th. And in that press release, CEO Bob Conlon said this transaction is in direct response to our customers' desire for a more holistic approach to GRC program development. That includes both compliance and integrated risk management. I was wondering if you could provide your thoughts on how the acquisition of Lockpath really provides a more holistic approach to GRC within the Navex Global family of offerings.
Yeah, absolutely. What we saw, and you're seeing this a lot, there have been a couple of acquisitions announced recently that there's a bit of a consolidation here. For Navex specifically, and as it related to Lockpath, I think our customers are more confident expanding their use of technology. They already know and trust the provider. And so in our case, the more areas of risk identification and mitigation we can help them cover, the better. They can talk about a broader range of issues. We know we can address more, or at least most of them holistically, as opposed to going to multiple vendors for the different identified areas of risk. So that was a natural for us.
One of the things that intrigued me about this acquisition was perhaps not the substance of it, but the type of services that Lockpath provides in the greater context of GDPR, the CCPA, which will go online the first of the year, and data privacy, data protection, and cybersecurity. And that's cybersecurity and data breaches have become an incredibly important part mergers and acquisition, pre-acquisition due diligence. And I was wondering if you could outline your approach, or at least Navex Global's approach to these issues.
Yeah, well, yeah, as you know, I mean, anymore, when you're buying a company, you're essentially buying data. When you do that, especially if you're doing a stock purchase, you're buying, their previous data, their current data, and any potential data security problems they have in the future. So it's not enough anymore just to identify potential breaches or cybersecurity incidents, but you have to actually get down into the processes, the procedures, the code, if you're in our field, and the people, and understand not only has there been any, that's a much easier inquiry, but what is the possibility of them, of those occurring in the future? Because any cybersecurity vulnerabilities are going to weigh heavily on evaluation, brand, reputation, etc. So that would not be a headache any company would want to
Shon,
buy.
in an article on law.com, you said, quote, Shane Harrison, our Senior Vice President of Corporate Development, has a very defined acquisition procedure, which details an acquisition from the pre-contact of a target through full integration. First of all, I was incredibly pleased to see that process and procedure be discussed by you. But I was wondering if I could have your thoughts perhaps on why it's important to have that procedure in place before you even begin the M&A process.
Absolutely, Tom. I think, speaking globally just for a second, you have to have everybody knowing where they are in the process. And my rationale for that, and our rationale for that is, one, so people aren't doubling up and you're wasting resources, but more importantly I don't think you've got something covered or you think I've got something covered, and there's a massive gap in your process. Our process is, as I detailed out, that you put people with subject matter expertise, the SMEs, in charge of various aspects of an acquisition. First, they're tasked with creating a comprehensive due diligence list. What in their subject matter area that they know better than anybody is important to find out about. Then during the due diligence phase, they're going to monitor those responses to their topical areas, and they're going to stay aware of how answers to their inquiries can also impact others cross-functionally. Then they're going to know better than anybody how to follow up on responses, when to push into an area, when answers are sufficient, when they're lacking. They also, at that point, have to be responsible for putting together an integration plan to realize the full value of that acquisition. And then once that acquisition is complete and the integration work begins in earnest, which is the real work, they're the ones that have deep knowledge in the workings of the target and are able to much quicker start executing on the plan. And the other important thing that I detailed in there, I believe, was they have ownership of that plan, both in their functional area, but for the entirety of the target. So you don't get the situation that I wasn't consulted, I wasn't in on it. If problems arise, they're not my deal. And that to me is death from an integration standpoint post-acquisition.
Shon, the Department of Justice about July of 2018 came out with a change to the FCPA corporate enforcement policy, creating a safe harbor for M&A work. And in that process, they emphasize that your pre-acquisition due diligence and other work informs your post-acquisition integration. And this, of course, was from the FCPA perspective, but it seems to me the process you described that Shane Harrison uses and Navex uses really lends itself to that sort of unidimensional continuum where everything is moving towards identifying information and putting together literally a roadmap for integration after closing. Would that be a fair assessment?
That's a perfect summary of it, Tom. And yeah, you're right in that it used to be you had, if you weren't diligent enough, you had a little bit of a pass. And you're right, with the new guidance, that pass on not doing your pre-work is less and less and less. And so by doing that pre-work, if nothing else, if you end up especially in the FCPA context, buying a problem, at least you've mapped out for justice that you tried your best to ferret that out pre-acquisition.
And it really sounded like in your description of the pre-acquisition steps, you've baked that compliance due diligence into your overall corporate, financial, and other due diligence of the target company.
Very, very much so. Yes, absolutely. And that's not just because we're an ethics and compliance company, as you know. That's any company buying any business.
So let me change the focus just a bit with the following question. As the top lawyer for an ethics and compliance software and risk management company, you must be hyper aware of the myriad of threats companies are facing these days. And what I really wanted to ask you is what, in your experience, are some of the threats that are more or even most overlooked by businesses?
First of all, I'd like to, kind of acknowledge that I think if we were having this conversation 5 years ago, I think this topic would have less weight. I don't think there were enough people focused on it. So thankfully, I think for good reasons, because of bad outcomes, at least companies are much more aware. So I think they're taking some of those threats off. But what I think we're left with now is, again, to me, ethics and compliance, regardless of your vertical, it's a data business. And, you have to understand, what data do you have? Where do you get it? How do you distribute it internally and externally? How do you store it? When do you destroy it? And I think the thing that folks aren't looking at, and this is both from a people standpoint, a process standpoint, and a system standpoint, if you don't have a good idea of that flow, of that map, I don't think you can assess your threats, internal or external. I will acknowledge they're different for different businesses, but finding all that out for your particular business, I think is critical, or you're never going to know where in your specific situation, wherever you are in the life cycle of your business, what threats you are most facing.
Shon, would the assessment of those threats be done by a chief risk officer, a compliance officer, a chief compliance officer, a general counsel, or perhaps a collection of those disparate disciplines?
Latter on that, Tom, absolutely. I think you've got folks, again, I think you need somebody in charge of it, and I think that's dependent upon your corporate structure. But I think all of those folks need to be involved, as well does the business need to be involved, because I think, pick your business, you've got ops people that they're going to understand better than any of the others where potential threats might lie. And for them to be able to make the folks that are driving that process aware and make them aware of what they're doing to mitigate those, I think are all similarly important.
Well, Shon, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time, but I was wondering if listeners wanted more information on Navex Global's acquisition of Lockpath or any of the other concepts we've talked about in this podcast. Where can they find out more information?
If you happen to be one of the 14,000 Navex Global customers, go talk to your account manager. If you're not, you can find a lot of this at navexglobal.com. or at lockpath.com for information about both services.
Well, Shon, this has just been a fascinating exploration of what I think is not only one of the most significant acquisitions in the compliance space, but frankly, for me, one of the most exciting. I can't wait to see what you guys come up with together going forward.
Well, thank you again for having me. This was an absolute honor.
This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. We'll, of course, link to the references in the show notes. Also, Shon had a very interesting article in Corporate Compliance on this merger and acquisition and his process around M&A work generally. And we'll link to that in the show notes as well. If you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Thanks again for listening to this episode, and I hope you'll join us again next week for another episode. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.